Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. A big question right now for you personally. Do you think that the press has the ability to freely exercise their First Amendment rights? Citizens in a safe way when they're abiding by the law? Question, I present that to Anna Dyakin. She is an attorney representing the Knight Institute. The Knight Institute helps represent causes, people with free speech claims, whether it's going after a Democrat administration or Republican administration. They have represented causes that support the very First Amendment that our founders decided that would be of utmost importance for citizens of the United States. Here's a big question. Will another reporter's home be searched by the federal government, much like this Washington Post reporter had faced over the past week? Again, we don't know the exact circumstances when information may have been within the home, on the devices of this reporter, etc. But the critics say that this is going to be causing a chilling effect, not only for sources who go to journalists who feel like they have the ability to be a check on the government, but also journalists themselves who are trying to actively also not only exercise their First Amendment rights, but freely pursue a story, including those who are ethical and objective. Again, my conversation with Anna dives into all of this. We talk a little bit about the influence of influencers who claim to be reporters, the impact that they have, considering that the algorithms might pick them up more than a traditionally trained journalist. Because it seems that a lot of the content that we are fed on our own individual feeds are individualized streams of content. What you see might get you heated. It might get you really excited. Will it bring you back to that platform again? There are some cases where journalists might not necessarily be very flashy and engaging or really drum up a lot of emotion. Is that a reason why some of these influencers are getting more attention than those who are traditionally trained journalists? We talk a lot about that. I also asked her if these social media companies have a role here. Are they possibly regulating free speech because of these algorithms? We get to the back and forth of the legality of that. Anna gives us a nice, fresh legal perspective on some of the issues that many reporters and journalists are talking about every single day and may feel that they may encounter during their own professional and personal life. I also asked her about some things that journalists possibly should know right now about their rights, but also making sure that they are continuing to do their job within the boundaries of the law. And after my chat with Anna, we can talk a lot about the lingering questions of the headlines that are going to drive the news cycle, likely going to drive the news cycle in the next week. Venezuela, Greenland, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, Minnesota. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair who's currently under probe. There's some pushback here, including from one member of President Trump's cabinet, tariffs and more. Oh, and in my chat with Anna, I have a special guest who wanted to give their insight. Give me 1 second. Oh, special guest, come on over. Come on over, special guest. This is Oliver. He has wisdom, knowledge, and he's just a comfort. And he wanted to say hello. So say hi. He's just supervising. He's my chief fact checker. Aren't you? And so we're grateful to him for that. Oliver, thank you. There he goes. Oliver's collar and the metal that's attached, including his air tag, because yes, I have to track a basset out. He could be going around the corner following a scent and I can't find him. Anyway, you might hear some of that jingle jangle throughout the interview. Just as a little bit of a heads up. It's not an added sound effect. Again, thanks to Oliver. So with that, let's get into my conversation with Anna Dyakin. Let's do it. And joining me now is Anna Dyakin. She is a senior staff attorney and managing attorney with the Knight Institute at Columbia University. And I really appreciate your time and you joining Byline. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
So take me square one. How did the legal bug first bite you and your interest in representing free speech causes?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to my time in law school. I went to law school hoping to work in the human rights field. I saw myself working abroad as a human rights researcher. And then as I learned more and more about our legal system and the injustices here at home, I realized that I probably had some cleaning up to do in my own backyard before I went off to try to, change anyone else's situation. So, my background is in national security law, and I was at the American Civil Liberties Union and their national security project for a few years, and then came over to the Knight Institute, where I work at the intersection of both of those areas.
I did catch that portion of your bio, and I'd be interested in having a separate conversation, possibly about Venezuelan strikes, obviously the capturing of Nicolas Maduro. But we're here to talk specifically about protection of journalists in the current moment that we are at right now. And just for our listeners, you have fought for folks and fought for First Amendment causes under the Trump administration and under the Biden administration, right?
Absolutely. The Knight Institute recognizes that no matter the administration, there are certain entrenched interests, and any government in power is going to, when it comes to the area of freedom of the press and interactions with the press, is going to want their own narrative out there. And by design, the press and government are have a kind of abrasive sometimes relationship. The whole function of the press is to serve on the check of the government, serve as a check on the government to help hold the government accountable. So naturally, you're going to have First Amendment issues crop up there.
Before we dive into any specific issues, do you feel that the First Amendment is at its most fragile moment in American history, or do you think it's still solid? The courts, judges recognize its prudence?
I don't know that there's an easy way to answer that question. I think the story of our country is a story of a push and pull or on these rights and these interests. And I think, you do see a lot of really disheartening and discouraging opinions coming out of the courts these days, but there are also bright lights that shine through that show that some of these values are still alive and well. And so we certainly believe really strongly in them and view it as the First Amendment is a really necessary and important tool for keeping the government in check. And so, yeah, we have confidence in the cases that we're bringing and the cases that we see other similar organizations bringing as well.
And if you could, just for our listeners, maybe give a couple examples, if you're able to, of some high profile cases that the Knight Institute has spearheaded.
Sure. One example that I worked on in the last year or so was a challenge to the U.S. Treasury Department's sanctions regimes. And in that case, we had a client, which was a nonprofit, a U.S. nonprofit that held events abroad. So what it would do is it would bring U.S. citizens, but also citizens from other people from other countries, whether it be government employees or members of the media or academics, bring them to a country. In this case, it was Lebanon, and set them up in a conference to talk to a whole variety of people from across the political spectrum. They would get one-on-ones with, members of the opposition party, various voting blocs in parliament, journalists who work, in Beirut, that kind of thing. And in this case, that organization who had these meetings that it convened to sort of enhance the flow of information, make sure that people in the U.S. really understood the issues and, understood the background and wasn't just kind of digesting government talking points, for example. They wanted to invite the full range of the political views. And in that case, it involved people who had been designated under U.S. sanctions regimes. There are many at play there. And I think there are 5 different individuals who they thought were, very, key power players locally and, people that Americans needed to hear from in order to understand the political situation there. And the U.S. government said, no, you can't talk to those people. You can't hear from them. They're designated. That's against our foreign policy to let you do that. So we filed a lawsuit. And it was only a week or two after we filed that the Treasury Department said, all right, let's have a conversation about this. And they
Okay.
ended up reversing their policy. So that's one of the areas I work on. That's the intersection of national security and First Amendment law.
Obviously, over the last decade, in the era of Donald Trump's political prevalence, his leadership of the Republican Party, the fake news narrative continues to be spewed from the president, his allies, books online, those who generally distrust members of the journalism world. I do want to ask, backtrack if you can a little bit, maybe some other examples of the last quarter century where First Amendment freedoms or journalists have certainly been attacked domestically.
Yeah, so I would say, when looking at the raid of the Washington Post reporter's home on Wednesday, the searching of her home, that was an alarming example of an intrusion on press freedom, seizing her devices, seizing her computers, her phone, her Garmin watch even. And I don't know anything that rises to that level, but there certainly have been instances where administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, seize journalist records. And so you can think back to 2010 under the Obama administration, where there's a correspondent with Fox News, James Rosen, and the Department of Justice obtained a search warrant, I'm sorry, for his email. And that was in connection to a investigation related to leaks about North Korea. And then back in 2013, news broke that the Associated Press had subpoenas for about 20 of its phone lines. It was again under the Obama administration related to various investigations there. And so you see this tension between the press and the federal government in this case, whereas, the government, of course, has its interest in keeping its information secure, but it also has an interest in controlling the narrative and controlling the information out there. And that has led to serious intrusions on reporters' freedoms.
Hypothetically speaking, if the government, and the government has done this, come out and said, well, we are, pursuing a subpoena, a search warrant for national security purposes, what's your pushback to that?
Well, I would say in this case, for example, it seems very unclear why this was necessary at all. That is what they say. They say, she had been in possession or obtained and was in possession of classified documents, but she notably hasn't been charged with anything herself. She has not been accused herself of any wrongdoing. And they had already had executed a search of the government contractor's home and had his belongings as well. So it's just unclear why this additional intrusion was
What message do you
necessary.
think that it was sending? Was it intentional?
I can't
There's got
speculate
to
on
be
the
proof,
government,
right? You can't speculate. I get it, but
but I
what
will
message do you
say
think it does send secondarily?
it sends a very clear message to reporters, and especially in this context. You can't forget that just a few weeks ago, this same Washington Post journalist wrote an article about how her first person account of how she had become what she called the federal government whisperer or something to that effect after she had posted her signal information on a Reddit thread of federal government employees. And then after doing so, she amassed more than 1,000 sources from the government, former and current, who wanted to tell her about what was going on in the government, how they saw their age being hampered by the current administration's policies and efforts, and what they thought was the wrongdoing that was happening, and they thought it was in the public interest to tell someone in the press about it. So it's the same person who had been reporting very tenaciously about the government workforce, about Venezuela, about issues really core to our democracy right now. And a few weeks later, she had her home searched.
Is there a credible claim in some hypothetical scenario where, say, a source comes to a reporter, they have not reported on whatever information that they have provided to that journalist, where the government can issue a search warrant because that reporter now has access to highly sensitive government information? Does that hold water at that point, or what protections would be in place for reporters who, say, come across a scenario like that?
What's happened in the past is reporters have been issued subpoenas, for example, and they have fought those subpoenas in court for their records. I think the most relevant Supreme Court case, I think, that would inform the situation is case about the Pentagon Papers. And in that case, it was a question about whether a news outlet could publish classified information, essentially. And the government wanted to stop that from happening before it even happened in the first place. And what the Supreme Court said in that situation is that you can't place what they call a prior restraint on the publication of that information. They have a right to publish that information. Unfortunately, the court left open the question of whether or not a news outlet or a journalist could be punished after the fact for publishing that same information, which is quite confusing. But so far, that's been a red line that no administration has crossed, at least with a journalist.
I went to school for print journalism. I took ethics classes, as many, I don't want to say legacy, but traditionally trained journalists have. And these newsrooms, just to be clear, people have ethical standards. There are desks, if you will, entire operations of newsrooms where law is considered, but also the consideration of, is this story going to do more harm than good? Who is it going to impact? And that's something that newsrooms weigh. They weigh if, say, there is very sensitive information. Take the instance of the capture of Nicolas Maduro. There was some reporting, I believe it might have been the Washington Post or the New York Times, that may have been tipped off that something might have been happening. But I believe that they didn't go ahead with it because they were worried that American soldiers could be hurt.
Absolutely. There these strong ethical standards that the media have is what I think one of the core things that has kept this relation going and functional. And there are, by all accounts, kind of a lot of conversations that happen behind, in the back room that the public doesn't see about, explain to us your reason why this is such a danger to national security. And I think they do take a do no harm approach and certainly hold back information.
Obviously, the work that you do is to protect free speech for anyone, no matter what background. I do want to ask, in the age of social media and the algorithms, where you can be an influencer who has not been trained in journalistic ethical principle, who may appear or say that they are a news reporter, a journalist, but clearly they're walking a fine line where there's some questions about their tactics, some opinion that's also provided and things like that. Is there a problem right now that you see with, say, a traditionally trained journalist might make a free speech claim, and some of these influencers who claim to be reporters, would the way they produce content muddy the waters for a free speech claim by somebody who is, a typical objective journalist?
Well, I would say even influencers have the right to, give their take on the news, to hold themselves out as experts on topics, and to give their opinions on what they think is going on. They certainly have a First Amendment right to do that. I think, what a lot of First Amendment lawyers would say is the response to bad speech is more good speech. So it's a matter of, the journalists and the news media, making their case for why you should listen to them. And I think the example you gave of the ethical standards is an important one. I think another important quality that journalists bring is the context. When journalists have been on a beat for a while, they know the background. They can see something happen, like this search of a Washington Post reporter's home, and know, oh, yeah, back in 2010, this happened. In 2013, this happened. And this is what it means in the bigger picture. Whereas someone that's not as steeped in the history and hasn't been as immersed in the issues wouldn't have that background. But I would say for consumers, for people who are scrolling TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever else, it just means that media literacy is so, so important. And you have to really think twice before reposting, sharing. If something seems incredible or like, wow, that's unbelievable, that's crazy. Well, it might be.
Do you think it's up to Congress to maybe set some standards here, some laws for maybe states to promote media literacy courses in whatever way that they see fit in order to achieve that goal?
I mean, certainly I would be in favor of more media literacy classes, more resources available for people to learn what it means to be media literate, to, have an evolving understanding of that as our technology changes. But certainly no sort of rule or restriction against, what an influencer could say or could do, because, they do have their rights as well. There's, you have in most cases, you have even lying is protected First Amendment speech. So, and you can understand why, right? You don't want the government in the business of saying what's true and what's false. You don't want the government to be able to control the positions that are okay and the positions that aren't okay to take.
We know that some of these influencers, based on the algorithms, which seem to promote content that brings you back for more, right? It may be an issue that gets you hot or an issue that you largely agree with. Content is being specifically driven out to specific people. I want to ask, could a reporter who, by many accounts, does not necessarily give a sexy presentation, a colorful presentation on TikTok of a news story,
Yeah.
and the algorithm doesn't pick it up, but it'll pick up something completely different? Is that reporter's speech being squashed because the algorithm is not putting it out there to other consumers?
I would say certainly not in the First Amendment sense, right? The First Amendment cares about government control over your speech. So this is, we're talking about a private platform and their algorithms and how it promotes or doesn't promote certain types of speech. I mean, one thing that the Knight Institute has advocated for is more transparency about those algorithms. It's really hard to know. So these algorithms are, as you said, shaping the information that you're taking in. They're shaping your information environment. And when you change the inputs, you necessarily change the outputs, right? And it's really hard to know how you're being influenced if you don't know how the algorithm is working. You don't know what you're not seeing and why. You don't know why things are directed to it not. So we have definitely advocated for more transparency on that front so people can have a better understanding of just what they're receiving and why on social media.
So is that an advocacy campaign to the private tech companies, or is it also to, say, Congress to try and get something done here to make it happen?
I mean, certainly the best outcome would be that tech platforms take it upon themselves to provide this information. And, if they stand by, their methods and their means, I think that they should go ahead and do so. Back to your larger point, I do think one problem right now is just there's a lot of noise and it's really hard to filter it out and to figure out what's true and what isn't. And especially if you haven't had any training whatsoever. And so to those people who are saying, I did have a sense that this video was a little weird, but I wasn't sure and I didn't know how to check it. And the answer to them is, look for corroborating sources. If you see something from one source that you're not sure about, before you repost it, before you share it, check other sources. What are they saying? Or go to fact-checking websites, other things. There are other tools out there to help you separate fact from fiction.
Have the courts ever ruled, say, against independent journalists, freelancers in a way that, say, legacy organizations may have gotten a favorable outcome?
Are you going towards something specific? I guess I can't think of an exact example.
Obviously, we'd have to look at specific cases. I'm just curious, if the law has ever treated independent journalists, freelancers differently than those at legacy organizations.
Yeah, so I think it definitely depends on the context. One circumstance, I could imagine, the law there being encompassing a lot of things. For example, when you see protests, that's been a big issue that's come up over the last few years again and again, access to information at protests and who gets to stay and who gets to report. So one thing that some local governments have done, for example, is let's say they put a curfew in place. Some of them have had carve outs to that curfew that says, okay, everyone must disperse by 10 p.m., for example, but journalists can stay to document then what happens after the curfew order goes into effect. And that's really important, right? Because if there was just a full dispersal order, then journalists themselves would be at risk when they're just there, not for the protest activity themselves, but just to document the interactions between the protesters and the law enforcement. So there may be examples where things like curfew orders, the exemptions would favor people from legacy news outlets, people with certain press credentials, and not sort of the citizen journalist. I think a big question that we as an organization have grappled with over the last few years is who is a journalist?
How would you define it?
I would define it based on function and not necessarily where you work or what school you went to. If you have a formal press badge, I'm most concerned about protecting the activity. Are you engaged in news gathering? Are you collecting information for the purpose of disseminating that information out to the public, to help the public understand what's going on, to understand what's happened at that protest, what happened at that, town hall meeting, whatever it may be.
And does it have to be fair and objective? Not necessarily balanced, but fair and objective.
I think.
And who's to determine what is?
What is fair and objective? And who do you want deciding what fair and objective is? I think we all probably have our own particular political leanings, and you may be fine with your own political party making those determinations, but are you fine with the other party making that determination? And how can you be consistent on that front? So yeah, I would say that's the real hang up on any kind of restriction in that sense.
If you did hear a little jingle in the background, it's not because my Christmas decorations are still up. I've got a basset hound waking up from a nap right now, so forgive me.
Oh, no.
Let me ask this. I want to go back to the Washington Post reporter whose home was searched by federal officials this week. Is there anything that reporters can do right now to protect themselves, prior to something like this possibly happening again, or even after the fact?
Yeah, I would say right now, and this is what I've seen chatter about online, is just to make sure that your information security practices are really tight and up to date. Make sure that you, I guess, good digital hygiene, if you will, and that your, information is secure. If your laptop was obtained, that things are sufficiently protected. I hope. So the fear when something like this happens is that there's going to be a massive chilling effect, not just on the government sources who understandably are very afraid to, talk to reporters now. They don't want to be next and they don't want to be targeted in a government leak investigation. And certainly now they'd be afraid that anything they told a reporter could then be obtained if that reporter was searched. I also fear, the journalists themselves and suddenly there are a lot more risks to doing the work that these people are passionate about, and it takes a lot of courage. And so I hope that would be my number one hope, is that they all still maintain the courage to do the fearless reporting that they've been doing.
Has there ever been an example that you can think of where a reporter had sensitive material from a source, say that reporter was hacked, somebody, bad guy, got access to it, and that reporter got in trouble because of it, even though they didn't move forward with the story? Reporters actually culpable in this scenario?
Never heard of that situation happening myself. I can't say that it never has happened. I just don't know of anything to that effect. I would say, I mean, all the more reason for journalists to be very, have secure, very secure practices and to keep their information locked down.
Can you see a world where a journalist might be charged in that scenario?
I would hope not. I would be very skeptical of any claim arising out of there. And certainly, one good thing is that we haven't seen journalists yet charged for just receiving information, even classified information from government sources. If journalists are obtaining this information, not engaged in any wrongdoing themselves and obtaining that information, there shouldn't be any charges against them. And there would be strong constitutional arguments that that activity is protected under the First Amendment.
Last thing I want to talk to you about is a little bit of tech and AI. Do you think that we're entering an era where algorithms are regulating free speech and maybe not just the government?
I mean, certainly algorithms will have a huge impact on speech and the information that we have access to and how we think about things. But maybe you could say more about what your concern is there.
I think you touched on this earlier too. You're more concerned about the government cracking down on the
Yeah.
right to free speech rather than private company can, your argument, do what they want, to an extent. And this might be a brand new conversation to have too. I don't have a specific example. I'm curious if the algorithms and the power that they have to disseminate certain information might ultimately have a role here.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. One thing, we're called the Knight First Amendment Institute, right? But we're not only concerned with the First Amendment and the role that the government plays. We're concerned with a healthy online free speech environment, a healthy speech environment. We want the digital public square to be alive and well. And yeah, we with, advances in technology, it's certainly changing the information that people have access to and even how they think about that information. You see there are very well documented filter bubbles online, and, I have certain political leanings, so the information that's fed to me will tend to just reinforce those leanings, and that leads to polarization. And so I think there's definitely a lot to be concerned about in that regard. Again, I think an answer for that is more sources of information, not just solely going on TikTok, and not just solely on this one platform, not just solely reading the New York Times, not just solely watching Fox News, exposing yourself to many different sources of information on many different platforms in many different forms. That's how you're going to be the most informed, have the best idea of, best in the best position to assess for yourself what the truth is and then what to do about it, how to hold your government accountable, how to participate in democracy.
I wrote down the scenario here, and I just want to get your insight. And you might not have a concrete answer on it, but in some hypothetical scenario, say John Doe is on TikTok. He is increasingly staying engaged with content that may be radicalized in nature. John Doe acts out. Say the government then goes after that social media platform saying, hey, it was your algorithm that was feeding him this content that was ultimately led to this violent situation. Would the tech companies, would a social media platform possibly have any role or accountability here?
These questions are being researched and litigated right now. The question being, and I think the core question at the heart of it is, what speech rights, if you will, do platforms themselves have in, you know, designing an algorithm in a certain way, moderating their content in a certain way in a platform, choosing to take up or leave down, or to take down or leave up certain information. And, it's not a simple answer where that line would be, but certainly platforms have rights of their own that are implicated here. And so it's not just a matter of what the government, can and cannot do to you to regulate your speech. It's what it can and cannot do to the platform when it itself is engaged in speech activities.
Let me ask about that too, because gone are the days where Facebook or Twitter, it appears to have just been a market square, a town hall where anyone can speak. They are now producing these algorithms and selecting content with them that is being fed to people. Do these platforms really no longer have that claim that their hands don't have blood on them at this point because they're the ones that are pushing out certain content?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the platforms do or don't stand for different things, right? And so I think what you see and the appropriate response in these situations, like let's say X, right, which notably changed a lot of its content moderation policies. It looks very different than the Twitter of several years ago did.
Yes.
And as a result, people, voted with their feet in a sense, where now you see a lot of people have moved over to Blue Sky or Threads or are making use of other platforms. And those platforms suit their needs better for what they want. If you still want to see sports clips or other things, maybe people have chosen to stay on X or for, whatever they're looking for. I mean, you could say the same for Truth Social. The people that are active on Truth Social are people who are seeking a certain kind of experience.
What are some current gaps in your mind in federal protections of free speech for journalists?
Yeah, well, one huge gap, I would say, is there's no federal press shield law. Most states have a state shield law. So that would be a law that would protect journalists from this kind of compulsory process, like this search warrant or subpoenas or other court orders, and that would go after governments trying to identify journalist sources or journalist work product. And so because there is no federal shield law and the Supreme Court hasn't spoken clearly on this issue, what has happened is that primarily the primary source of protection for journalists on the federal level has been internal Department of Justice policy, their news media guidelines. And, these guidelines are decades old and have been revised several times over the past, 50 years at this point, probably, often in response to controversies, times when people perceive there to be government overreach. Most notably during the Biden administration, in response to the Trump administration's subpoenas for emails and records from journalists from CNN, Washington Post, and New York Times. This news broke at the beginning of the Biden administration, and Attorney General Garland put a new policy in place that basically said, nope, we're going to have a ban on this kind of compulsory process against journalists. You can't do it except for in really specific situations related to journalistic activities, of course. And that was a huge victory for press freedom, but it was discretionary. It was DOJ's internal policy. And at the time we said, hey, as soon as there's a new administration in power, they could change that policy and it wouldn't be hard. So we need a federal law codifying this. And there was a federal law called the Press Act. It was bipartisan. It passed the House, but ultimately did not pass the Senate. Then you got to this spring, and AG Bondi rescinded that Biden era policy that I was talking about. So she rolled those protections right back, and here we are.
The Pentagon's policy to essentially review information that reporters receive before they're published, does that blatantly violate the First Amendment?
The policy to review before the publish. Oh, yeah, that I think that would be a blatant violation. It would certainly violate all sorts of norms. It would, journalists are not meant to be the mouthpiece for the government. It's not just another source of the government's message. They're the fourth estate. They're supposed to be reporting not just on what the government wants you to know and what it wants you to think, but on, what other information they can gather and expose government corruption or criminality even. And of course, the government isn't going to affirmatively offer that information up itself. So that's why confidential government sources are so important.
Last two things I have for you. Your time is precious. I appreciate it. What are your advice for any journalists who may be covering protests right now, whether you're in Minneapolis, anywhere in the country? Obviously, if police tell you to move, you should probably do it. But what advice would you have to not only make sure that your free speech protections are kept intact, but you're not causing potentially some trouble for yourself?
Yeah, I think what you said is absolutely right. But they should review their own newsroom policies about what their First Amendment rights are in those situations when they have the right to record and when they, are subject to dispersal orders. But I think most importantly, it's not what happens in the moment, but what happens in the lead up to the moment. And so I think it's really important for newsrooms, professional organizations, other media organizations to be engaged in dialogue with law enforcement before the protests even break out, saying, here we are, this is what our mission is, we understand what your interests are, and here are our rights in these situations, and this is what how we're going to exercise them. And there have been some reports that some of these First Amendment trainings and law enforcement in certain police forces have actually improved relationships between the local media and law enforcement. So I think there's ability to open a kind of dialogue would be really helpful. Obviously, if you were talking about federal forces coming in to quell local protests, it's a different matter altogether, and it's much more difficult.
Last question, I promise. Looking ahead, what court cases do you think reporters and journalists should keep an eye out for that are coming down the pike?
Yeah, I think two very related to what we're talking about today. One is the New York Times sued the Department of Defense about its Pentagon press policy. And so I think there's going to be sort of a faster schedule than usual in that case, and it's going to be heard, I think, in March. So hopefully we'll have an answer from the courts about the constitutionality of the Pentagon's policy.
Are you confident that the Times can win?
I'm confident that they can win. They have very strong arguments. I don't think there's any justification for the Pentagon's policy in this circumstance. And another one is the Associated Press's case when it was blocked from the press pool. And so that case is also pending decision in the appeals court. So we'll see what happens there. So both of those cases will have a big impact on the press and the relationship to the federal government today.
Fair enough. Is there any hypothetical scenario or argument do you think the government could possibly win with in those cases?
I think there are clear constitutional rights at stake here. And I think that both the AP and the Times will see victories.
Okay. Well, obviously, you don't want to put an idea into your opponent's head, so I get that too. But I had to ask a question. Anna, thank you for your time. I know we went a little bit over, but I'm appreciative of your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
1,500 troops reportedly on standby to possibly be deployed to Minnesota if the situation there worsens, according to the perspective of President Trump. We know that the protests have only gotten larger, louder, after the ICE agent there had shot Renee Good in her SUV over the last 2 weeks. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement arm of the United States of America, was on a Sunday show and had said that currently, right now, the officer that shot Renee is not under investigation. That may change, but right now, It's not. He says millions of people, or many people, I'm paraphrasing here, had seen the video. His take was that she was using her vehicle to go after that officer and cause bodily harm. He'd also claimed that not every single investigation where an officer uses force when they are acting in self-defense, his words, are put under an investigation. Well, my experience as a reporter, any investigation where an officer uses lethal force or most types of physical force is going to be under investigation. Officers put on temporary paid leave, unpaid leave in some cases, until that investigation has wrapped up. So there are a lot of questions about why Todd Blanchett said that, because historically speaking, officers are on leave, not on the beat when they are under investigation, so that an independent determination can be made. By the way, a lot of questions about free speech. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Fry also continue to be under investigation. They're both Democrats. The claim here is that they are engaging in a conspiracy to block ICE from doing their job. Speaking of investigations, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell continues to apparently be under the probe of federal officers if he lied to Congress in the Senate testimony last June about numbers and figures associated with an ongoing renovation project to the Fed headquarters in Washington, D.C. Reportedly, some pushback from President Trump's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. More pushback growing about this investigation of the head of an organization that is traditionally independent and not influenced by politics. President Trump, as we know, wanted interest rates lower than what the Fed has determined to be the standard. The key question is the president going after the Fed chair because he disagrees about the interest rates that they had decided on. This isn't the first time that a criminal investigation, or at least a law enforcement investigation, has been launched against perceived opponents, even though Jerome Powell, many people would argue, is not a political figure, have faced the legal arm of the United States of America, former FBI Director James Comey, Attorney General of New York State Letitia James, former National Security Advisor to President Trump John Bolton, all under individual investigations. They're perceived enemies of President Trump. Again, judge it by a case-by-case basis. You be the judge. I'm just laying out the context. That's what we do. No spin, no fluff. And if you're not specifically aware of the individual circumstances of those cases, I encourage you to go look at them. I will be quick, considering my interview with Anna was prolonged, but certainly full of, I thought, valuable information. A lot of questions surrounding whether the United States is going to go forward with the purchase of Greenland. Is the United States going to acquire Greenland? We don't know. We know that America's allies and troops were sent to Greenland reportedly for some training after the president had signaled that he wants to acquire, buy Greenland. We don't know. President Trump then came out and threatened tariffs on some of our allies to the tune of 10%, possibly could go up even more if they apparently block any effort of the United States to acquire Greenland. Again, the president says it's for national security purposes. This headline is not going away. Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister Carney, reportedly got on a call with President Trump, had signaled that he does not think it is a good idea to tariff any American allies, potentially disrupt NATO. The agreement where American allies have said that they're going to stand up for each other. An attack on one is an attack on all. Could NATO be jeopardized if the United States acquires Greenland? And again, is Russia and China going to feel emboldened based on America's attempt to possibly try and acquire Greenland? Is China going to go into Taiwan? What's President Trump going to have to say to that? What are the diplomatic conversations going on behind the scenes right now between American officials and Chinese officials about any possible invasion of Taiwan? Any further military demonstrations near Taiwan that would ratchet up the tension there? Certainly. And then we still got to keep a close eye on Venezuela. Former President Nicolas Maduro, he's still on American soil. Opposition leader to the Maduro administration, Corina Machado, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, went to the White House and presented that exact same medallion, that prize, to President Trump for his work to ensure peace, prosperity were the words that she had used, and on that plaque in her presentation to Mr. Trump for his efforts across the world, she says that he deserves it. Well, as we know, the Nobel Committee came out said that Nobel Prize is not transferable. But by all accounts, President Trump still has it in hand. What questions do you have? What concerns do you have about the state of the press's ability to do their job in light of what critics are saying? And that is a possible pressurization of journalists to do their job. The Washington Post reporter's home was searched. That is a rare move. The so-called fake news narrative has been certainly used over the past 10 years in the era of President Trump's political prowess. Are the courts going to increasingly take up cases that are related to free speech? We don't know. I thought the conversation would have been prudent to have with Anna. I am appreciative for you chiming in. What questions do you have about the current state of the country? What questions do you have about what is driving the news right now? Email bylinewithbendennis@gmail.com. Send me a DM. You have the free ability to do either. I want to hear from you, and I want to bring your questions to the experts, the change makers, and those who are driving the headlines and who are, again, joining me here to provide context and analysis. Also, those who may receive a little bit of pushback. Format here is to have a conversation, a dialogue, without a specific time constraint. With that in mind, please enjoy your week. Take care of yourselves and everyone around you. And thanks for saying hello to Oliver. He says hello back as well. He's a good little doggy. With that, we will see you later. Take it easy.